Okay, following on from where I left off, I just realized that I have to have an hour here. This is one differences in the version, so it should all work now. So I've got an error, but you see we moved on. We have trace file path is not a valid or not supported. So I've actually missed a colon here. And we have our trace ID. So this is now running. I can now execute and I can see my trace ID too. And the execution times, file sizes, etc. So this is now running. And according to our preset, it's going to create up to 500 megs. It's going to create 2 output files, and it's going to run for a max 2 hours. So we can potentially change that to 3 hours, 4 hours, or whatever your required gathering is, and we can have it roll over. So just to see as an example, if I physically go to that path, I go to data, there's my first trace file. Now there's not a lot of activity going on at this point, so there's not a lot to collect in that trace file. So at this point we're going to do what they used to do on BBC TV when I was a kid, which is a TV show called Blue Peter, and say, here's one we made earlier. So I actually have a SQL profiler that I recorded earlier. So I'm going to open that file. And we can see within this what would be the content of an average trace file. So we can see executions, and probably the best example I can give you is here, where we have a select against sales order, date key. You might remember this from the earlier section. And we can see the CPU time that's used, the number of reads, durations. And remember, you can filter these columns when you're creating your trace file, that only over a certain value you bother to include. So you could say, I'm interested in, let's say, queries that take more than 6,600 worth of CPU time. And then you would collect and you would have a trace file only containing those. So you can do it in a more filtered way to get what is the best reads, the writes, what's actually consuming the load. You could equally include the performance monitor data if you've set up your performance monitors earlier that day, and you do have SQL performance monitors. So just as an example, there are SQL performance monitors for databases, and you can have also the performance monitors for CPU. So let's say as an example that I had the CPU graph. I would be able to check the CPU graph against this query and see what the overall load was at that time. So you can actually combine these two together, which is extremely useful if you have that data. Because then you can say, okay, in the middle of the night we had, let's say as an example, a deadlock. CPU spiked, that was the cause, and go back to it. So this is very good for troubleshooting in that respect. But there is one other thing that this trace file is particularly useful for, and it's the final one in the tool set. It's the database engine. So the database engine tuning. It's a bit of a mouthful. In this scenario, what you have is a couple of databases. So I'm going to go for my marketing one. I can take my trace file. So here's one I captured earlier. And I'm going to say I want to do some tuning. I want to see what would happen if I had better indexing, better partitioning, better structure. Basically, based on what it's captured in terms of queries, could I get better performance? What are the suggested? Now, normally you would take a trace file from a production system, and you would take a backup from the production system, and you would load them somewhere else, and you would do this kind of tuning away from the production system, because you don't want to really put some load on the production when you're really looking for, is this index used, is it not? So you might look at this as the staging environment or development environment where you will restore production style tables. Again, it might not even be production data. You just need to fill it up with an equivalent amount of dummy sets of data so that you can simulate the same playback. So I'm going to start the analysis. It should run quite quickly because there wasn't a lot captured in the earlier examples. And what it's going to do is then replay the workload. Based on the replay, it's going to then take the performance and it's going to make some suggestions. And here we have. So we've got the suggestions. And you can see you have the option here to show existing objects. So you've got all the existing objects. And what it's telling me here, if I just select, is that in my marketing DB, these two indexes, which were created earlier, are not particularly good indexes. So sometimes it will tell you that to create new indexes, sometimes it will tell you to drop ones. So it's telling me in this scenario that these two indexes are not heavily used, they're not getting the best results. So effectively they're dead weight, and they're extra resources being used which are not being touched by the queries. Now, this is a moment when you might want to say, okay, but are they really being used? Are they just not being used in the time period I captured? So that might require further investigation. You can also take the actions to save the recommendations or apply the recommendations or schedule the recommendations for later. So you don't have to do these immediately. I could say, all right, I'm happy with my recommendations, or I can evaluate. So I can do another evaluation based on what is it like if I don't have those. But for the moment, I'm going to take these recommendations and I could say I'm going to apply them, or I'm going to save them. So I'm going to save my recommendations. And that's created. So I can come back to that later, or in this case, because we don't really have a later, we're going to do it now. We're going to just simply go and open that. So here's my recommendations, and here you can see here's my marketing DB and the two indexes it suggested dropping. And that's it. That's the overall view of how server-side traces work. Sorry, that's just my phone going, and that wraps up our section. I hope you enjoyed the course, and I'm welcome to feedback if any of you have further details or interest in a particular subject, or you thought it wasn't expanded enough. Please write me. I'm happy to improve the course if needed, or cover further deeper examples where you believe you need those examples to be. Thank you.